year 16 AD to the mid-19th century, there existed a peculiar and strange profession called sin-eating. Families who lost a loved one would surrender them to these sin-eaters, often giving them a meager amount of money to absolve the sins of the departed. The process involved placing a piece of bread on the chest or face of the deceased, allowing the sin-eater to absorb their sins. The sin-eater would then consume the bread, taking on the guilt and responsibility for the sins of the departed. In a way, the sins would become a burden on the sin-eater, whether from the people or themselves. When questioned by the sin-eaters about their occupation, they claimed to follow the tradition of Christ, who supposedly cleansed the mistakes of humanity. Despite the Catholic Church holding a monopoly on forgiveness for many years, it declared that sin-eating was not a sin. If someone engaged in sin-eating or employed sin-eaters, they were considered unbelievers, facing consequences in both this world and the afterlife. The sin-eaters believed that by absorbing the sins of different individuals, they would cleanse the sins and the purified souls would be sent to heaven, gaining attention and respect among the people. People were fearful of sin-eaters, believing that staring at them for more than a few seconds would attract demonic troubles and misfortunes. This fear contributed to sin-eaters living secluded lives away from cities and people. This peculiar profession existed in England for 300 years, gradually fading in popularity as people became reluctant to participate in this terrifying and unusual ceremony. Years passed, and people started burying their loved ones without the elaborate rituals. Richard Muslow, a wealthy resident of the village of Rattling Hope in England, decided to address the immense suffering experienced by people when losing their loved ones. Despite strong opposition from his father, Richard chose to become a sin-eater, reviving an ancient tradition to bring solace to those grieving. This decision marked the beginning of a new chapter in the story. I now grant you comfort and ease, dear man. For your peace, I have dedicated my own soul. Amen. Days passed, and Richard, now living in seclusion outside the city in a dilapidated hut as a sin-eater, would perform specific ceremonies whenever a villager died. He would recite a text, eat sin-laden bread, and continue this life until one day a villager approached Richard's hut, knocking forcefully on the wooden door. Upon opening the door, the man stated, "Your father is very unwell, and in these final moments of his life, he wishes to speak with you." Without hesitation, Richard set off towards his father's house, his mind flooded with 1,000 thoughts. His heart rate doubled with anxiety, feeling that he might die at any moment. Before reaching his father's home, he was immersed in his own thoughts and imaginations. Finally, he arrived at the home of his father, which was now nothing like before. In the silent atmosphere of the house, he heard the weak breaths of his father, as if waiting for his son in one of the solitary cells of this large, indifferent prison. His father lay on the bed, a white cloth drawn up to his knees, waiting for his son. Time was very short, and both of them knew it. Therefore, much time was not spent on formalities. Richard's father began reading a text that he had prepared in his mind over all these years. He said, "I know that people lay their burdens of sins when they are no longer in this world, but I want to inform you of my sins before I die." Translate this text to English. Many years ago, when I was 7 or 8 years old, I was playing in the yard of my house in the midst of my childhood mischief. I picked up a small stone from the ground, rolled it, and threw it. I swear, when I threw it, I saw it going straight in our neighbor's yard. There was a 4 or 5-year-old girl who had made a swing for her in the yard. When she came in the afternoon, she was playing with it. I don't know what exactly happened, but then I heard the scream of that little girl. I reached the foot of the wall very quickly. I went up the wall with difficulty and saw a poor girl holding her face with her small hands full of blood and crying loudly. She had a direct stone in her eye. No one understood where this stone came from. To this day, no one knows that I really threw that stone, even the girl herself. I sat behind the same wall out of fear, and I wanted to cry, but somehow my neck was so swollen that I couldn't catch my breath. I made myself home with misery and went to sleep in a corner and threw a blanket over me, like I've been sleeping here for a long time, and finally they will find me. And the next day, the parents of that girl, who were our neighbors for how many years, came and asked, "Do you know who did this calamity that happened to our child?" My mother, who was a very careful woman, told them that we were out of the house all afternoon that day, and we were unaware. He probably said that to avoid any possible trouble, but I wish he was telling the truth, and we really went out that damn afternoon. There was no news from them for a while. It took a few months for that little girl to return to normal life, and finally one day I saw her in the street and realized that the intensity of the collision was too high and caused her to lose one of her eyes. An artificial eye, like a damn little painted stone, filled the empty eye socket forever. I was too young to react to this story other than fear and wetting my bed. This caboose is the soundtrack of all my childhood memories. Days passed and I saw that little girl growing up when people made fun of her, the neglect she received, how she withered every day, and only I knew in this world who was responsible for this crime. But I did not dare to say that it was my work. Of course, saying it didn't cure the pain anymore. I was 17 and 18 years old when a young girl came to our village with her family. One day, I happened to see her from afar in the village market, and that moment was enough for me to fall in love with the most beautiful creature that God had ever created. It didn't take long for me to realize that she, too, was interested in me, among all the boys in the village who had wished to stand by her for just a moment. She liked only me, and this self-confidence, which I had lost, was gradually returning. As time passed and we got closer, I distanced myself more from my recurring nightmares. She, like a nurse or an angel, treated the scars of my childhood, replacing the bandages on the dirty wounds to speed up their healing. I remember she always said that one day we would leave this village together and live in the city, surrounded by all the light and beauty of life. I was happy at the prospect of leaving this place, and I wouldn't wake up every morning in my imaginary courtroom. However, the burden of guilt was on my shoulders, and now, when I am on the brink of happiness, it haunts me more than ever. I wanted to go to our neighbor's daughter, whose eye I had lost due to my foolishness, and tell her the story, but I was afraid she would never forgive me, and everything would become worse than before. Now that I was close to fulfilling my dreams, she, confined to her home, despised me, detaching herself from my happiness. It was in this state of mind that I received the news that she had committed suicide again. This time, her family, who had never left her alone since that incident, saved her with difficulty. If it weren't for the timely intervention, I would have known that I was the main culprit in her death. With a small stone, I had changed the life of a person, and now I was somehow killing her. With this heartbreaking news, on that ominous day, the evil incident of my childhood passed in front of my eyes for the 1,000th time. The issue this time was a matter of life and death. This time, like my childhood, I couldn't escape this crime. So, I married her. I had to somehow get rid of these courts to some extent, but the next sin threw a black cloth over my whole life. I killed the love in myself and the person I loved so that I could pay for the sin of my childhood. And this was my next sin. Of course, I could not love this woman because she was the reason for my separation from my dreams. For years, I was only present in this life, and he knew it, but he never told me. I never told him the truth of the story so that he wouldn't feel sorry for him. When you were born, seeing your face and seeing your eyes gave me a little motivation to continue. But now that you are gone for a while, I and this woman and this house have been buried under that black cloth again. Mr. Sin Eater, I committed 2 big sins. Throwing a small stone and killing a big love were enough to turn me into this soulless creature. Therefore, death is the only cure for me. I knew that when I die, you will surely participate in my ceremony as a Sin Eater. I wanted you to know before you die the sins that you are going to take from me. But I want you to help me as much as you can and send me from this hell to heaven because I can't bear this blackness anymore. Richard was shocked. On the one hand, his father's confessions. On the other hand, the secret of his mother's eyes. And most importantly, this heavy burden that he had to carry for the rest of his life so that his father's soul would rest in peace had made him unable to speak a single word. Richard's father died on the same day. After the funeral, Richard returned to the same deserted cabin and lived for a long time with his father's sins and thought about how sorrows can eat people alive before they die. Days passed until one snowy midnight when the sound of wolves howling. He had just woken up when the villagers were fast asleep when someone knocked on the door of Richard Manslow's cottage house. To be continued.